The gravel crunched beneath the tires of my 20-year-old Ford F-150 as I pulled into the lot at 412 Mill Street. It was 2:15 on a humid Saturday afternoon in South Carolina. The air hung low over the salt marshes, thick enough to taste. I cut the engine, and the heavy hum of the V8 died away, leaving only the solitary, metallic rasp of cicadas in the overgrown weeds beside the fence. I sat still for a moment, resting my hands on the worn leather of the steering wheel. My knuckles were rough, scarred, and permanently stained with walnut oil from 40 years of precision woodworking, but they didn't shake. At 71, after 4 years in the Marines and a lifetime of running my own shop, you learn one fundamental truth. The moment you let anger rush your hands is the exact moment you ruin the timber. I looked through the windshield at the location my daughter-in-law had sent me. 412 Mill Street was not a party venue. It was an abandoned cotton shipping warehouse on the broken industrial edge of the county, 20 miles outside Charleston. The tin roof was rusted through in jagged patches. A heavy padlock chain bound the front steel doors, and a faded yellow notice was stapled to the weathered wooden gate. Property condemned. No trespassing. I picked up the handwritten note resting on my passenger seat. The penmanship was slanted and elegant, written with a fine blue gel pen. It belonged to Victoria. Harrison. It read, "Leo's 10th birthday gathering is at 2 p.m. today. Old Dock Diner, 412 Mill Street. Please be punctual. We have very important guests arriving and cannot afford delays. Before I tell you what I did next, please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you're new to the channel, welcome." I didn't curse. I didn't slam my fist against the dash. Instead, I reached over and touched the smooth, hand-rubbed oil finish of a small wooden box sitting on a clean cotton towel in the passenger seat. It was a handmade music box carved from a single block of solid walnut. I had spent 3 weeks in my shop crafting it for my grandson, Leo. I had hand-turned the internal brass gears, tuned the comb myself, and set a small silver Marine Corps commemorative coin inside the lid, the very coin given to me by my old unit when I retired. Leo was 10 today. For 6 months, all he had talked about was coming to my shop, sitting on a wooden stool beside my workbench, and learning how to carve his own sailboat. Grandpa, he had told me over the phone last Tuesday, his 10-year-old voice bursting with excitement. "Mom says I'm having a huge party with giant balloon arches and catering. But I told her I just want you to bring that box you promised me." I had promised him I would be there. Now, sitting in an empty parking lot 20 miles away from civilization, the reality of my family's dynamic settled over me with ice-cold clarity. Victoria had never intended for me to reach that party. My mind traced back over the past 4 years, connecting every subtle snub I had previously brushed aside for the sake of keeping the peace. When my son, Julian, married Victoria, I welcomed her into our lives without reservation. Her father, Richard, was a prominent commercial real estate developer in Charleston, a man who wore $3,000 suits and made a point of never shaking hands with anyone whose nails showed signs of physical labor. Victoria had inherited her father's obsession with social geometry. To her, life was a stage performance where people were either assets to display or embarrassments to hide. And I, with my sun-faded work coats, my old Ford truck, my silver hair, and my quiet, unpretentious voice, was an embarrassment she couldn't control. 3 months ago, during a brief visit to their home in Mount Pleasant, I overheard Victoria speaking to Julian in the kitchen while I was outside on the patio. Julian, her voice had carried clearly through the open window. Sharp and laced with disdain, "We cannot have your father showing up to the country club mixer looking like an off-duty handyman. My father's investment partners will be there. What are they supposed to think? That my husband comes from a family of blue-collar workers?" Julian hadn't defended me. He hadn't said a single word about how that handyman had worked 50-hour weeks for 30 years to put him through college debt-free. He had simply murmured, "I'll make sure he stays home." Honey. I had stayed silent that day. I told myself that young marriages are complicated, that Julian was under pressure, and that an old man's pride wasn't worth starting a fight that would put my son in the middle. So I quietly swallowed it. When they bought their 4-bedroom home in a gated Gulf community, I silently authorized an $80,000 wire transfer from the Vance Family Trust to cover their closing costs. When Victoria wanted Leo enrolled in St. Jude Academy, an elite private school where tuition rivaled a university's, I quietly set up a recurring monthly transfer of $3,500 from my personal account to pay the headmaster directly every single term. I never asked for a thank you speech. I never demanded a seat at their country club tables. I did it because Julian was my son, because my late wife Martha would have wanted her grandson to have every advantage, and because I believed that silent, unconditional support was what a father owed his family. But in Victoria's world, silent generosity isn't seen as love. It is mistaken for weakness. As I sat staring at the condemned sign, my flip phone chimed on the console. It was a text message notification, forwarded directly to Julian's number. Julian had hit forward on a thread without reading what was attached underneath. The original message from Victoria to Julian read, "I sent your dad the note for the old warehouse on Mill Street. That should keep him driving around the county for at least 2 hours while my dad introduces the board members to Leo. Make sure he doesn't call the main desk at Grand Harbour. We can't have him standing in the lobby in that old jacket when General Sterling arrives." Underneath her text, Julian had typed a single line to me. "Hey, Dad. Just checking if you got the address note." I read her words 3 times. My pulse didn't race. My hands didn't shake. The hurt didn't turn into shouting or tears. It turned into something much heavier, much colder, and entirely permanent. Victoria thought she had orchestrated a clever little game to protect her social standing. She thought she was sending an ignorant old veteran to a dead end in the woods while she put on a show for Charleston's high society. What she didn't know was that the entire new wing of the Grand Harbour Club, the very ballroom she had rented for thousands of dollars, had been built 15 years ago through a veterans support grant that I had personally co-founded and funded. She didn't know that my name was engraved on the bronze benefactor plaque right beside the main entrance. And she certainly didn't know that General Thomas Sterling, the guest of honor her father had spent 6 months trying to impress, was the same Marine lieutenant I had dragged out of a burning armored vehicle in the desert 35 years ago. I folded the note, placed it carefully inside my pocket, and picked up the wood music box. I turned the key in the ignition. The V8 roared back to life, steady and solid. I shifted into reverse, backed out of 412 Mill Street, and pointed my truck straight toward the gates of the Grand Harbour Club. The drive from the abandoned warehouse on Mill Street to the Grand Harbour Club took 25 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't glance at my phone again. I just kept both hands on the wheel of my Ford F-150 and watched the salt marshes give way to clean asphalt, manicured oak trees, and the sprawling brick estates of historic Charleston. At 2:45 p.m., my phone chimed in the cup holder. It wasn't a text. It was a phone call from an unlisted number. I tapped the speaker button. Harrison speaking. "Grandpa?" The voice was small, hurried, and muffled, coming from what sounded like a carpeted room. It was my grandson, Leo. "Hey, buddy," I said, my tone immediately softening. "Happy birthday, Leo." "Grandpa, where are you?" he whispered. I could hear the faint sound of running water in the background. He was calling from a restroom. "Mom said you couldn't come because your truck broke down. But I saw your favorite tape measure on the kitchen counter this morning. Are you coming?" I felt a quiet tightening in my chest, but my voice remained steady. "I'm on my way right now. Leo, where are you standing?" "I'm at the big building near the water," he said quickly. "The one with the huge fountain out front and the tall glass doors. Dad called it the Grand Harbour. Mom made me wear a navy blue blazer with brass. It's itchy, Grandpa. I hate it." "I know, buddy," I said gently. "Hold on tight. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Did you bring the box?" "I have it right beside me." "Okay," he whispered. "I'm going to slide back to the table before Mom catches me. Bye, Grandpa." The line went dead. I set the phone back down. So Victoria hadn't just sent me to an empty warehouse. She had also fed my grandson a lie about my truck breaking down to cover her tracks. She had turned a child's birthday into a scripted performance where the grandfather was written out like an unwanted extra. I pulled up to the security gate of the Grand Harbour Club. The security guard, a young man wearing a crisp black blazer and a radio earpiece, stepped out of the booth. He looked at my old truck, his eyes lingering on the faded blue paint and the wooden tool rack mounted in the bed. "Afternoon, sir," he said, holding a clipboard. "Members and invited guests only today. We have a private function in the main pavilion." "I know," I said calmly. "The Vance family party." He scanned his list. "I have a Julian and Victoria Vance listed for the Bayside Ballroom, but I don't see a Harrison Vance on the guest roster." I reached into my breast pocket, pulled out a small leather wallet, and slid a heavy silver card across the windowsill. It was a standard membership card. It had no credit card number, no expiration date, and no barcode. It simply bore the crest of the United States Marine Corps inlaid in brass, alongside 4 words etched in dark navy steel: "Charter Lifetime Benefactor, Harrison Vance." The guard looked at the card. He looked at me. Then he tapped his tablet, swiped the screen, and his posture visibly changed. The casual indifference vanished, replaced by an immediate, professional stiffness. "Mr. Vance," he said, handing the card back with both hands. "I apologize. The system didn't flag your arrival. Pavilion parking is reserved out front." "Thank you." "Son," I said, "is General Sterling's detail already here?" "Yes, sir. General Sterling's motorcade arrived 20 minutes ago. They're currently in the Commodore suite prior to the reception." I nodded, put the truck in gear, and drove through the wrought iron gates. Grand Harbour wasn't just a country club. Built on 80 acres of prime waterfront property, it was one of the most exclusive private establishments on the East Coast. What Victoria didn't know What my son Julian had never bothered to learn during his desperate climb up the corporate ladder was how this place had come to exist. 15 years ago, the land was owned by a commercial development firm that wanted to turn it into high-density condominiums. My former commanding officer, General Thomas Sterling, along with 3 other retired officers from my old unit, formed a non-profit trust to buy the parcel, preserve the coastline, and build a sanctuary for active-duty personnel, veterans, and community leaders. They needed $3 million in seed capital to secure the deed before the developers closed in. I didn't have $3 million, but what I did have was a 40-acre parcel of timberland near Beaufort that had been in the Vance family since 1920. I sold 30 acres of that timber, signed the check over to the trust, and took a seat on the founding board. I never asked for my name on the building. I never used the private dining rooms. I stayed in my workshop, worked my wood, and let the city's elite pretend they owned the place. I parked the Ford F-150 right in the center of the VIP turning circle, directly between a sleek black Mercedes and a brand new Porsche SUV. I cut the engine, stepped out into the humid Carolina heat, and unbuttoned my canvas work jacket. Underneath, I was wearing a clean, dark navy button-down shirt and pressed slacks, the same clothes I wore when I inspected finished cabinetry for high-end clients. I reached into the cab, retrieved the walnut music box wrapped in its white towel, and placed it inside my jacket pocket. As I walked toward the glass double doors of the main entrance, 2 valets in gold-trimmed uniforms hurried toward me. "Sir, this area is for valet parking only," one began. I didn't stop. I simply held up my hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "Leave the keys in the truck, son. It's staying right there." Something in my voice, the quiet, unyielding weight of 71 years of living on my own terms, made him freeze in his tracks. He stepped back and nodded without another word. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the air-conditioned grandeur of the Grand Harbour lobby. Crystal chandeliers hung from 3-story ceilings. Marble floors reflected the sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling bay windows overlooking the marina. Near the center of the lobby, standing beside a giant floral arrangement of white roses and hydrangeas, was my condo, Victoria. She was wearing an emerald green designer dress, holding a glass of champagne, and laughing politely with an elderly couple I recognized immediately. Her father, Richard Sterling Montgomery, and her mother. Standing half a step behind them, looking uncomfortably stiff in a tight charcoal suit, was my son, Julian. Victoria turned her head, her laugh fading as her eyes caught movement near the entrance. When she saw me standing there, canvas jacket in hand, silver hair unstyled, walking steadily across her polished marble floor, her jaw dropped, and the champagne glass in her hand tilted so fast a splash of sparkling wine spilled onto her silver heels. Victoria didn't move for 3 full seconds. She stood frozen beside the marble fountain, her emerald dress catching the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers. The splash of champagne was still dripping from the hem of her gown onto her silver heels, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on me, wide, disbelieving, and rapidly filling with a sharp, ugly rage. Beside her, her mother, Margaret, lowered her pearl-encrusted reading glasses, looking at my sun-faded canvas jacket as if a stray dog had wandered into an art gallery. Her father, Richard Sterling Montgomery, simply shifted his weight, adjusted his gold cufflinks, and let out a soft, dismissive snort. Only my son, Julian, looked away. He stared down at his polished leather shoes, his face pale, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles beneath his skin were visibly twitching. I kept walking. My boots made a steady, low sound against the gleaming white marble floor. "Harrison," Victoria whispered, her voice dropping an octave as she hurried forward, stepping right into my path before I could reach the center of the lobby. She kept her tone low, but it was laced with pure poison. "What are you doing here?" I stopped 2 feet in front of her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't adjust my posture. I just looked at her with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man who has seen far too much of the world to be intimidated by an expensive dress. "I came to see my grandson," I said. "It's Leo's 10th birthday." "You were given specific instructions," she hissed, taking a tiny step closer so her words wouldn't carry toward the other guests mingling near the bar. "You were supposed to go to the Old Dock Diner on Mill Street. That's where we arranged for you to meet us later. Mill Street is an abandoned warehouse." "Victoria," I said plainly. "It's been condemned for 6 years." For a fraction of a second, her eyes flickered. A tiny twitch at the corner of her lip gave her away not guilt, but annoyance that her lie had been exposed so quickly. She recovered almost instantly, smoothing her emerald skirt with one manicured hand. "There was a scheduling change," she lied without blinking, her voice completely cold. "Regardless, this is a private, formal reception. My father has invited board members from 3 major investment firms. The city council president is on his way. This is not a backyard barbecue. Harrison, look at you." She gestured dismissively toward my canvas work jacket, my dark button-down shirt, and the plain leather belt at my waist. "You drove that rusted eyesore of a truck into the main circle," she continued, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You walked through these doors looking like you just stepped off a construction site. You are embarrassing Julian. You are embarrassing this entire family." I turned my eyes slowly toward my son. Julian was 35 years old. He had a degree from Chapel Hill, a senior title at a wealth management firm, and a home in a gated neighborhood. But standing there in his dark charcoal suit, under the glare of his wife and his father-in-law, he looked smaller than he had when he was 10 years old, sitting on the floor of my workshop crying over a splinter. "Julian," I said softly. He finally raised his head. He couldn't hold my gaze for more than a second. His eyes darted toward Richard, then toward Victoria, before settling somewhere near my collar. "Dad," he murmured, his voice strained and thin. You really shouldn't have come like this." Victoria worked for months setting this up with her father. "It's a very delicate business dinner as much as it is a birthday. We told you we'd come by your house tomorrow with some cake. You sent me 20 miles out of town to a locked fence." "Julian," I said. My voice was very low, very quiet, but every word landed like a stone in quiet water. "Is that how you treat your father?" Julian swallowed hard. "It was just a misunderstanding. Dad, please, just go back to the truck. Let us finish the formal introductions. I'll call you tonight. Don't make a scene here. Please." "Make a scene," I repeated gently. Victoria stepped between us again, her heels clicking loudly on the marble. "He doesn't have to make a scene, Julian. He just needs to leave. Right now." She turned to face me fully, her chest rising and falling quickly under her green silk dress. The pleasant, high society hostess mask had completely cracked, revealing the raw, entitled Arrogance underneath. You think because you built a few kitchen cabinets and served in some old war 30 years ago that you automatically deserve a seat at every table? She said, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper that burned with contempt. You don't belong here, Harrison. Look around you. These people own companies. They sit on hospital boards. They build this city. You are just an old man biding his time in a dusty woodshop, clinging to memories nobody cares about anymore. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a small leather wallet, and took out $200 bills. She held them out toward my chest. Take this, she said coldly. Go get yourself dinner at a diner somewhere. Tell Leo you had a work emergency. Do not ruin this afternoon for my family. I looked at the $200 bills hovering in the air between us. Then I looked at Victoria's face. I didn't take the money. I didn't even reach for it. I simply kept my hands at my sides, my right hand resting lightly against the smooth walnut edge of the music box tucked deep inside my jacket pocket. My family, I said quietly, was built on sacrifice, hard work, and keeping your word. It wasn't built on fake addresses and stolen dignity. Victoria's face flushed deep red. She snapped the money back into her purse and turned toward the front desk with a sharp wave of her hand. Security, she called out, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of two couples standing near the grand staircase. Excuse me. Security, over here, please. The shift manager, a tall man in a navy blazer named Marcus, whom I had known for nearly 8 years, hurried across the lobby, accompanied by a broad-shouldered security guard in a black uniform. Marcus looked flustered, carrying a tablet under one arm. Mrs. Vance, is there a problem? Marcus asked quickly, stepping between us. Yes, there is a major problem, Victoria said, pointing a sharp acrylic nail directly at my chest. This man walked in through the front doors without an invitation. He is harassing my guests. He refused to leave when asked, and he parked a commercial work vehicle directly in the VIP circle out front. I want him escorted off the property immediately before my father's board members arrive. Marcus turned to look at me. For a second, he just stared. Then his eyes drifted down to my jacket, up to my face, and his eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a single word, the quiet chime of the private elevator echoed across the marble lobby. The heavy brass doors of the Commodore Suite elevator slid open. 4 men stepped out into the bright afternoon light. They were all in their 70s, all wearing dark, impeccably tailored suits, and every single one of them carried themselves with the rigid, unyielding posture of men who had spent their youth commanding troops under fire. Walking at the center of the group was a man with thick silver hair, a sharp, weathered jawline, and a small gold Marine Corps lapel pin resting on his dark jacket. It was General Thomas Sterling. Richard Sterling Montgomery immediately straightened his tie, forced a wide, obsequious smile onto his face, and took 3 quick steps toward the elevator, holding out his hand. General Sterling, Richard announced loudly, his voice echoing through the lobby, perfectly timed for everyone to hear. Sir, we are so honored you could join us for my grandson's reception. General Sterling didn't look at Richard's extended hand. He didn't even slow his pace. His sharp blue eyes scanned the lobby, passed over the fountain, passed over Victoria, and locked directly onto me. The entire lobby went completely silent as the 4 retired officers stopped in their tracks. General Sterling stood motionless for 2 seconds, his eyes fixed on my face, before he slowly raised his right hand to his temple and brought it down in a crisp, perfect, unyielding military salute. General Thomas Sterling's hand remained at his temple for 3 long seconds. In the military, a salute is not a casual greeting. It is an acknowledgement of character, of shared fire, and of debt that money can never repay. And when a 3-star general stands in the middle of an elite country club lobby and salutes a man wearing a sun-faded work jacket, the world stops moving. The silence that fell over the Grand Harbour lobby was absolute. Richard Sterling Montgomery's hand froze mid-air. His forced smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. Victoria stared at the general, then at me, her mouth slightly open, the emerald silk of her dress shifting as her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Beside her, Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. General Sterling slowly lowered his hand, stepped past Richard without giving him a second glance, and stopped directly in front of me. He looked at my face, his sharp blue eyes taking in the silver hair, the weathered skin, and the steady, unbothered posture I had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Sergeant Vance," the general said, his voice deep and gravelly, carrying easily across the high marble ceilings. "I was told I'd find you in the private dining room. I didn't expect to find you standing in the lobby being handled like a trespasser." I adjusted the canvas jacket over my arm and gave him a faint, respectful nod. "General, it's good to see you looking well." "Looking well?" Sterling let out a short, barking laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "I'm breathing, Harrison. And every morning I wake up on the right side of the grass. I remember who dragged me through 200 yards of burning sand outside Al-Khafji in '91 while artillery shells were turning our Humvee into scrap metal." He turned slowly, sweeping his gaze across the small crowd that had gathered around us. "Some of you folks in Charleston know me because of my rank or my foundation," Sterling continued, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet, lethal authority. "But if it weren't for Staff Sergeant Harrison Vance disobeying a direct order to fall back, ignoring a shrapnel wound in his own shoulder, and pulling 3 men out of a burning wreck, I wouldn't be standing here today. None of the work I've done for veterans in this state over the last 30 years would exist. Not a single bit of it." Richard cleared his throat nervously, his face turning a blotchy red. "General, we didn't realize. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Julian, why didn't you?" "Quiet, Richard," Sterling said without looking at him. Marcus, the general manager, stepped forward quickly, holding his tablet with hands that were visibly trembling. He looked at Victoria, then at Richard, and finally at the general. "General Sterling," Marcus said, his voice tight with professional anxiety, "Mr. Vance is not a guest who required an invitation. Sergeant Vance is one of 4 charter lifetime benefactors of the Grand Harbour Club. His name is on the founding plaque in the West Pavilion. He holds unrestricted access to every facility on this property, including the private boardrooms." Victoria's head snapped toward Marcus. "What?" That's impossible. His truck, Marcus interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm now that the legal authority was clear, is parked in Space 1, where it belongs whenever he chooses to honor us with his presence. I looked at Victoria, the woman who had just offered me $200 to leave, who had called me an embarrassment and a stain on her family's reputation. looked like she was shrinking inside her designer dress. Her mother, Margaret, was clutching her pearls so tightly her knuckles were white. Her father, Richard, a man who prided himself on knowing every influential figure in the state, stood completely paralyzed, realizing that the guest of honor he had spent 6 months trying to cultivate had just publicly humiliated his family for treating my sacrifice as garbage. Julian took a step toward me, his hands shaking, his voice cracking. "Dad." I swear I didn't know about the founding pass. I didn't know about General Sterling. "If you had just told us." "Told you?" I asked softly. My voice didn't carry anger. It carried something far more devastating. Disappointment. "Julian," I said, looking my son straight in the eye, "a father shouldn't have to present a resume to his own son to be treated with basic respect. I didn't raise you to measure a man's worth by the car he drives or the jacket he wears. I raised you to know the difference between substance and show." Julian looked down at the floor. He didn't answer. He couldn't. At that moment, the heavy oak doors of the Bayside Ballroom opened, and a 10-year-old boy in a navy blue blazer came running out into the lobby, ignoring his mother's sharp gasp. "Grandpa!" Leo yelled. He didn't care about the crystal chandeliers. He didn't care about the generals, the security guards, or the wealthy board members standing around in tailor-made suits. He saw his grandfather, and he ran straight across the polished marble floor, his small dress shoes squeaking with every step. I dropped my canvas jacket onto a nearby chair, knelt down on one knee despite the old stiffness in my joint, and caught my grandson in my arms. "Hey, buddy," I murmured, holding him tight as he wrapped his arms around my neck. "You came," Leo pulled back, his eyes shining with pure, unscripted joy. "Mom said your truck broke down, but I knew you wouldn't miss it." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small block of solid walnut. I unwrapped the white cotton towel, revealing the hand-carved music box resting in the palm of my hand. "I promised you." "Didn't I?" I said gently. "A Vance always keeps his promise." Leo took the box with both hands, his fingers tracing the polished grain of the wood, the inlaid brass gears, and the silver Marine Corps coin set into the center of the lid. He pressed the small brass latch, and the delicate, clear notes of an old lullaby drifted out across the silent lobby, filling the space where sharp insults and fake status had been trading moments before. General Sterling stepped up beside us, looking down at Leo with a warm, genuine smile. "That's a fine piece of work, young man," Sterling said softly. "Your grandfather built things that kept men alive. But I think this might be his best work yet." Leo looked up at the 3-star general, then back at me, his chest puffing out with pride. "My grandpa can build anything." "Yes, he can," Sterling replied, looking up to meet the eyes of Richard and Victoria, who were standing frozen near the fountain. "He builds things that last. Unlike some of the flimsy structures people try to construct out of pride and borrowed money." The general turned to me, offering his arm. "Harrison, the board members from the Regional Trust are inside. They've been waiting to hear your thoughts on the new veteran housing project in Beaufort. Will you join us?" I stood up, holding Leo's hand in mine. "I'd be honored." "General," I said quietly. I turned back to look at my son and his wife one last time before stepping into the ballroom. The trap they had set for me had collapsed entirely. But the real accounting, the final boundary that would protect my life and my grandson's future, was still waiting to be delivered. The Bayside Ballroom was quiet as General Sterling, Leo, and I walked inside. The grand space, with its sweeping glass windows looking out over the harbor and its towering floral arrangements, was filled with Charleston's prominent figures, business owners, retired officers, and community leaders. But as General Sterling walked beside me, his arm resting comfortably near my shoulder, every eye in the room followed us. Richard Sterling Montgomery and Victoria trailed several paces behind, moving slowly, their confidence entirely eroded. Julian walked beside his wife, his eyes fixed on the floor, looking like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet was made of thin ice. Leo held my hand tightly, his small fingers wrapped around mine. He carried the handmade walnut music box under his arm as if it were the most valuable object in the room. To him, it was. General Sterling stopped near the head table, where a large brass plaque commemorated the founding contributors of the club's veteran wing. He turned to face the room, raising a hand to gather attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling said, his voice echoing with authority. "Before we begin today's reception, I want to recognize a man without whom this wing, and frankly much of my own life, would not exist. Staff Sergeant Harrison Vance." Polite, warm applause filled the ballroom. Several older men near the front, veterans who recognized the Marine Corps emblem on my lapel, stood up to applaud. I held up a hand, giving them a modest, quiet nod. I didn't need speeches. I didn't need a room full of strangers validating my life. I had spent 40 years working with my hands, building an honest living, and serving my country. My dignity didn't depend on a country club membership. I looked down at my son, Julian. He was standing near the edge of the crowd, his posture slouched, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and confusion. "Julian," I said softly, stepping away from the general. Julian looked up, swallowing hard. He walked toward me slowly, Victoria following half a step behind, her green dress rustling against the carpet. The arrogance in her eyes was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, calculating panic. "Dad," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't realize who was coming today. Victoria and we just thought." "You thought I was an inconvenience," I interrupted gently. My voice was calm, free of malice, but cold enough to set a permanent boundary. "You thought an old man in a work coat would ruin your image in front of people you wanted to impress." Victoria stepped forward, her voice tight, trying to patch together her crumbling social standing. "Harrison, please. It was just a misunderstanding. We were stressed with the event arrangements. Of course we want you here. Your family." I looked at Victoria for 3 long seconds. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. "Family," I said quietly, "doesn't send a 71-year-old father to a locked warehouse on the edge of town so he doesn't embarrass you. Family doesn't lie to a 10-year-old boy about his grandfather's truck breaking down." Victoria's face flushed deep red. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I turned back to my son. "Julian," I said, "for 4 years, I have stayed silent while you let your wife treat my life like a secret to be hidden. I paid $80,000 toward your home down payment. I paid $3,500 every single month to cover Leo's tuition at St. Jude Academy. I did it because I loved you, and because I wanted my grandson to have every opportunity." I paused, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out the handwritten note with the fake address. I laid it on the table between us. Generosity, I continued, is a gift. But when it is treated as an entitlement, it becomes enabling. As of tomorrow morning, the automatic transfers from the Vance Family Trust are canceled. The $3,500 a month for the school, the extra support for your mortgage, it stops. Julian gasped, his eyes widening. Dad, please. We can't afford St. Jude on my salary alone. The house payments. Then you will live in a house you can afford, I said firmly. And if Leo goes to public school, he will learn the same lesson I taught you. That character is built by how you act, not by the tuition your family pays. Julian stared at me, completely speechless. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing the real cost of his own choices. I looked at Victoria one last time. You wanted to protect your social standing today, Victoria. Well, now you can build a life based on what you and Julian actually earn, rather than what you take from an old man you look down on. I didn't wait for her to reply. I didn't stay to watch her explain the situation to her father or her wealthy associates. I knelt down beside Leo one last time. I smoothed his collar and smiled into his bright, honest eyes. I have to go back to the shop. Buddy, I told him gently. Will you take good care of that music box for me? Leo nodded eagerly, pressing the box against his chest. I'll keep it on my nightstand, Grandpa. Every single night. That's my boy, I said, kissing his forehead. Come by the shop next Saturday. We'll start carving that sailboat. I will, Grandpa. I promise. I stood up, buttoned my canvas jacket, and shook General Sterling's hand. Thank you. Thomas, I said quietly. Anytime. Staff Sergeant, Sterling replied with a warm, respectful nod. Take care of yourself, Harrison. I turned and walked out of the Bayside ballroom. My boots made a steady, unhurried sound as I crossed the polished marble lobby of the Grand Harbour Club. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the warm, humid South Carolina afternoon. The sun was beginning to set over the marina, casting a golden light across the water. My 20-year-old Ford F-150 sat parked right in the center of the VIP circle, solid, steady, and unbothered by the luxury cars surrounding it. I climbed into the driver's seat, set my canvas jacket on the passenger side, and turned the key in the ignition. The V8 engine roared to life with a familiar, reassuring rumble. As I pulled out of the gates of Grand Harbour and pointed my truck toward the quiet river road leading home to my workshop, I looked at the rear view mirror one last time. I felt no anger. I felt no regret. I simply felt the deep, unshakable peace of a man who had defended his honor, set a necessary boundary, and reclaimed his life on his own terms. Before I end my story, I have one final question for you. When a family member treats your sacrifice as an entitlement, do you believe walking away and setting a hard boundary is an act of anger or an act of self-respect? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.